Well, Press TV's Joshua Blakeney joins us from Calgary now. Joshua, just how large are these protests growing?
Well, now it's morphed into 250,000 people on the streets of Montreal. This is an unprecedented situation. The arrests are not only in the hundreds, they're now in the thousands, with 2,500 individuals having been apprehended by the state who's trying to use force to deal with the quite simple situation. Canada has the third largest oil resources in the world. It has a relatively small population of about 33, 34 million people, of which about 32 million are not students. And the students had very legitimate demands. Quebec has a long background of aspiring towards a social democracy, of kind of being on the avant-garde of Canadian politics, kind of leading the way when it comes to social justice issues. And the attempts by politicians to use force and use antagonism rather than reason, logic and negotiation has led to this quagmire that they're now in. Interestingly, what didn't happen with the Occupy movement, where you had many young people coming to the streets, but often trade unionists and working class people who had to get up and work every day, didn't come in solidarity with many Occupy people in the Occupy movement. In the case of the students in Quebec, you now have the older generations standing up in solidarity with them, which is why you're seeing the numbers that you are on the streets of Quebec. And this is the biggest mass movement in Canada's history, and Canada's got a rich history of social protest and social justice advocacy. And so I think that this is something that's going to spread across Canada. I've actually spent time in Vancouver in this past week, and there were students out on the streets of Vancouver, which is on the other side of Canada, marching in solidarity with the Quebecois. And so I think that as I say, the Quebecois have often led the way and been the avant-garde. And I think this is now beginning to spread throughout Canada. And indeed, when we look in Spain, there's protests going on now in Spain. This could actually be something that's going to morph into a global struggle for education.
Joshua, these protests started with students protesting over tuition fee increases. In that regard, will there be some sort of concession on behalf of the Quebec officials? In other words, is there an end in sight for this impasse, or has it spiraled out of their hands?
Well, I think there's a great disparity between the kind of 1% and the politicians who are making the decisions, and the kind of paradigm of those who are protesting, who are the kind of 99%. You know, the politicians, they kind of thought they were being nice to the students by saying, oh, we're still going to do, we're still going to do this attack on your education, but we'll be nice and spread out over 7 years rather than doing it immediately. And the students just scoffed at that and laughed at that, because it was a risible attempt to, to defer the assault on education to the next, generation of students coming through. And so I think the politicians are kind of living in their own world, speaking their own language, are literally unbelievable to the protesters. And I think that they've now got a rude awakening happening, because they're having to confront, 250,000 people on the streets of, mild-mannered Canada. Canada has a perception of being a country where many people aspire to live in the world. It's viewed as, one of the countries with the highest standards of living in. But unfortunately, there's an elite in this country who are trying to attack the social safety net that has been established since World War II. And young people and the older generation are mobilizing in solidarity to defend that social safety net. And as I say, to reiterate, it was interesting that the students, one of their initial protests was outside a discussion to do with the resources in Quebec, and how the resources in Canada are going to be developed. This is a country that has oil, diamonds, gas, water, and yet none of that wealth is percolating down to the working class. And I think that people in Quebec value education a great deal. Indeed, Canadians do. And that's why you're seeing the kind of numbers that you're seeing, and it's spreading throughout Canada, to reiterate.
All right, many thanks, Joshua Blakeney, Press TV, Calgary. More lives lost in what has become a war of attrition in Afghanistan.